One of the things I turned to in life for comfort and an escape from my realities was drugs and skateboarding. From the age of 13 to 17, I kind of had the motto, I'm not here for a long time, I'm here for a good time. And I was really wrestling with this whole idea. I didn't really want it to be true. I didn't want the Bible to be true. I didn't really want Jesus in my life. And he knew I needed immediate help. So he went and brought me to my humble abode and got all my stuff and said, let's go. You're gonna move into my house tonight and we're gonna figure it out. And I had no directional desire toward ministry or pastoring, but he changed all of that for me. And so I really started to argue with God. Like, hey, Lord, it can't be me. I'm too young. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not qualified. I'm not sure I want to do this. Well, my name is Greg Huston. I am the lead pastor of Calvary Chapel in Belfast, and I wanted to tell you my story on how I got here. So, growing up, I would have never imagined or believed that I would be a pastor. In fact, I don't come from family that even has pastor in it. I know that I've met friends that, say they're third and fourth generation pastors. So for me to be a pastor is quite a journey. So let me bring you back to when I was a kid. Growing up, I came from a divorced home, and that was a very dramatic divorce between my mother and father. And so at about the age of 5 or so, I sort of started that quest of trying to fill that hole of father. And I had a stepdad come along, and he's a great man. He's a great husband to my mom. And by the time he came around, I was growing up and becoming more independent. And one of the things I turned to in life for comfort and an escape from my realities was drugs and skateboarding. And so I got very lost in drugs for several years of my life, as my teenage years. From the age of 13 to 17, I kind of had the motto, I'm not here for a long time, I'm here for a good time. And I didn't really care so much that if I lived into my 20s or 30s, I just wanted to live as hard and fast as I could, doing the drug lifestyle. And it just kept leaving me empty and unsatisfied and heartbroken over and over again. And it was actually a season of my life at 17 when my oldest sister, Sherry, let me live in her house. And she lived in a complex, like a housing association. And she was told, after I had done some things, I had some parties in her house that were not kind to the neighborhood. Her housing association told her that I was not allowed to live with her anymore, that they didn't even know that I lived with her and they weren't happy with it. Well, she made a deal with me because she knew I would be homeless, that she said, look, I will let you live with me. I'll take the risk myself of losing my house if you will just go to this Christian teen camp. And I wasn't very happy with that, but I looked at it like, what other options do I have? I legitimately have burned all my bridges. I don't have a place to stay. And here's my sister offering me somewhere to stay. So I reluctantly kind of looked at it like doing my time. I went to a Christian teen camp. And it was led by a Calvary Chapel, a pastor named Ken Graves. And it was a very different experience for me in church. He's a very rugged man with a deep voice and a powerful presentation. And as amazing and interesting as a man he was to me, what was even more interesting is that he opened up the Bible and he taught us teenagers. And not only did I see him open up his Bible, but I saw 100 teenagers opening up their Bibles, and it really caught me by surprise. And I'm sure it was communicated to me growing up, but I just didn't see it, that the Bible was God's message system to us. It was his way of telling us about himself and who we are. And so that week at that teen camp changed my life. And so the part of the story I would love to share with you, and sometimes when I think of it, it just seems so surreal looking back, and it's one of those real God moments. So, the week had unfolded, and I was really wrestling with this whole idea. I didn't really want it to be true. I didn't want the Bible to be true. I didn't really want Jesus in my life as much as I knew it was becoming clear to me that he really should be the Lord of my life. So on Friday night, they gave what is called an altar call, basically an invitation for us to accept Christ as individuals. And the pastor said in a very commanding way, he said, listen, now is your time. If you're wrestling with this, you need to stand up right now. And I was in such a deep conversation with God, is the best way I can tell. It was such a spiritual experience between me and the Lord. I remember being angry and saying, I don't want to do this. I'm not going to stand. I am not going to stand. I'm not getting suckered into this whole thing. I know how this stuff works. And as I'm sort of arguing with God, the pastor said, well, let's open up our eyes and recognize everybody else that's standing and applaud them for taking the bold step of standing for Christ. And sure enough, I was standing. I was so out of touch with my physical body that when I opened my eyes and I looked around, I realized people were looking at me. In that moment, so to speak, the voice of God said to me, you don't even know when to stand up, man, And I instantly knew I had to let go of my life. I had done nothing but make a mess of my life up until that point. And so I stood by the shore where I got baptized on the coast of Maine, and I looked out at the ocean. I thought, what am I going to do now? Everything's different. Everything changes from here on out. And where am I going to go? What am I going to do? Who am I going to be? I had no more identity. It was all gone. Everything else I had for an identity up to that point was sort of a lie. It was more of a front that I put out for people. And it was time to be serious. It was time to be sincere with who I was supposed to be and who God made me to be. And so I just prayerfully took steps forward, but I knew that I couldn't do it by myself. I knew I needed help. And there was another pastor there along this whole week. He was the youth pastor of the church that Pastor Ken was leading. And he really came alongside of me. And after I left that teen camp, he called me for months, and it actually drove me crazy. He would call my house, and my mom would say, hey, this Pastor Aaron called. And I would think to myself, man, I wish that guy would leave me alone. He's driving me nuts, I had a breaking moment. It was really cool to find out that his wife, Lisa, was instrumental in that. She was the one to say, hey, remember that kid? Remember he stood up? You need to go after that kid. And looking back on it, I know my pastor was a very busy man, and he had a lot of better things to do than track down some drug-riddled teenager that was running away from him. But a scenario happened in my life that drew me to want to go back to church. It had been, 6 weeks or so maybe since the teen camp. And it was my senior year of going into my final year of school. And the truth was, I looked at school more of like a party scene, more of like a connections opportunity. I really had no intention of graduating. So I knew at the end of my senior year, I'd be embarrassed, but I would just kind of slip off into the sunset. But this particular Sunday, I was heartbroken, and it was a Sunday afternoon. I called Aaron finally called him back. And he said, well, you need to come to church tonight. So we had a church service that I ended up getting to, and my faithful sister, Sherry, drove way across town to pick me up, to bring me to church on the other side of town, because she knew I needed this in that moment. We had a communion service, and that was probably still to this day one of my favorite communion services, because I was so overwhelmed by the presence of God in that moment. It was in taking communion in that moment was so powerful for me, because I realized this is the body and the blood of Christ, and I've kind of trampled it underfoot. And so I was, even now I get choked up thinking about it, but I was snot bubbles and I was just crying all crazy. And my pastor, Aaron, looked at me and put his hand on me and said, man, you got a lot going on, don't you, And sure enough, I did. I had a lot going on. And so my pastor took me upstairs and just talked to me about things. He said, do you have a license? Do you have a car? Do you have a job? And the answer was no every time. And he just realized I was a loser heading nowhere fast. And so he said, here's what you do. You get your stuff tonight. And he was perceptive enough, and he knew enough people and saw enough ministry that people need immediate opportunities. If you wait and put things off sometimes, it's the wrong thing. You give people an opportunity to go back to sin, they will. And he knew I needed immediate help. So he went and brought me to my humble abode and got all my stuff and said, let's go. You're going to move into my house tonight, and we're going to figure it out. And so a few months had gone by, and I was living with them, doing my senior year of high school. And it was just a sweet, sweet time being with such a godly man and a godly family for them to allow me into their home. And funny thing is that they didn't have much space in their home. And that's one of those great things that the Lord always multiplies what you have. And he'll use what we give, even if it's meager. And their house was so tight that I had to literally have a little bed under the edge of one of the ends of their table. And so eventually they would shift things around so that I could have a little more space. But the ongoing joke was I spent my senior year living underneath a table at their house, which was kind of a step up for me in the sort of the homeless lifestyle that I had chosen. But the note that I want to make at this point is how I needed godly influence. In my situation, it was godly male influence. It was godly men that stepped up and they took action, and they were bold, and they knew where they were going so they could lead me somewhere. And I would also add that I had great men in my life, but it was just the right combination, the right things coming together, and my eyes being opened that made this season so possible for me. And going to that teen camp started something that was a spark that created a flame with this pastor. And now to this day, he's sort of my father figure. I mean, I have many fathers, so to speak, but he is very near and dear to me in the fact that he is my spiritual father, like Paul was to Timothy. And he made ministry, which can be very complicated and sort of overwhelming for the average person, something very real and normal and average. And I really appreciated that. I remember as a kid laying in a pew, kind of half sleeping, half awake, looking at the pastor and thinking, what kind of job is that? Like, what do you do? You're putting yourself out of a job. What happens when you teach through the whole Bible? What are you going to do then? And I had no directional desire toward ministry or pastoring, but he changed all of that for me. He made it seem like something that was a worthwhile pursuit, and it was very attainable and very real, and it could change people's lives. And so that senior year, he would bring me everywhere. It was amazing. It was such a great season of my life, learning and growing spiritually just for myself, but I had no idea the preparation for ministry that would be. Plenty of stories. I remember one time he took me into a marriage counseling situation. This husband and wife, they pretty much wanted to kill each other by the time they had sat down in this office. And he came in and they saw him, and then I walked in. They looked at me like, who's this guy? And he said, this is Greg Huston. Is it okay if he sits in the corner? And to my amazement to this day, they said, sure. If that were me, I would have said, no, get the kid out of here. But they let me in the room, and I got to watch marriage counseling. I got to watch them bicker and fight. And my pastor just pointed something out to them, so simple. He said, you guys have been going back and forth with each other. All these issues you have are physical issues. You don't take out the trash. He doesn't listen to you. She doesn't do that. He said, but you guys have never once said or thought of the idea that this is a spiritual battle that you're in. And he brought sort of the presence of God and his word and the spiritual reality that we live in into that moment. And for me, it was a great learning experience. And to see things like that at 17 years old was life-changing. I mean, truly, it was like, what am I doing here? And now that I'm a pastor, I look back and think this was all the Lord's grooming and planning to get me to where I am today. But just being able to be exposed to those kinds of situations and those kinds of things. And I've looked back at it and thought, what are the chances that I would have lived with Aaron Dudley, this great man of faith? And the answer is very slim. It's a very slim chance that would ever have happened. But there's a pastor named John Corson who shares a story about his son who came to him. And his son was feeling kind of biffed because he was in ministry and he was being used by God, but he felt like he was only doing that because he was John Corson's son. John Corson, he was a famous pastor, and he felt like maybe I'm just riding on my dad's coattails. So he had that conversation with his father. And he said, Dad, the only reason I'm in ministry is because I'm a Corson. And he said, no, son, the only reason you're a Corson is because you're called to the ministry. And that paradigm shift was, why did I ever end up living with Aaron Dudley? Is that why I'm in ministry? It was like, no, God wanted me in ministry so I would live with Aaron Dudley. That was the route that he wanted me to take. So again, if you can put this all together, I'm a teenage mess. I'm extreme to the bone. I love hardcore, skateboarding, drugs. And I remember one friend summed it up nicely. He saw me at sort of one of my worst moments before I became a Christian. And he said, man, you are taking this thing way too far. And I was like, John, this is what it's all about. We said drugs and stuff, right? This is what we're doing. We're going all the way. Well, that same friend, a few months after I became a Christian, I was at church, raising my hands, clapping and singing along. He looked at me after the service was over, and sure enough, he said, man, you are taking this way too far. And for me, I knew he was right. That was my personality. I'm not going to do something haphazardly or lightly. I want to go full throttle. If this thing works, let's kind of hammer down and see what happens. And so I bought into the Christian ministry life model, and I wanted all that I could get. And again, my pastor was really good about making it attainable. I would approach him and say things like in awe, like, wow, how do you do all this stuff? And he would say, I've just been doing it for 10 years, and that's all. If you put 10 years in, you'll be in the same place. And he made things really simple and understandable to me. During my senior year, I should tell you, one of the most significant things in my life was meeting my wife. And that's a whole love story that would make the Notebook look like nothing, honestly. But I won't bother you with that. But my wife and I, our senior year, we fell in love. And she saw the passion that I had for Jesus and the love that I had for him. And she knew that she could follow me. So I had somewhat of a very non-romantic conversation with her, which was something like, hey, look, I'm going to move to down East Maine. I have no trade. I have no money. I can't promise you anything, but I promise I will love Jesus, and I will go wherever he calls us to go and do whatever he calls us to do, no matter what. And thank God she said, yeah, she came with me. And she came from a ministry family, so she got everything. She understood it. And so we fell in love senior year. I did 1 year of school of ministry there in Bangor with Calvary Chapel of Bangor. A great ministry experience, learning how to help residential men and women, but particularly in my case, men recovering from drug addiction. And it was just eye-opening for me to see people that have lived life all the way up into their 60s that were struggling with drug addiction and ruined their families, and they needed help from me, an 18-year-old kid. So after my training in the School of Ministry, I was sent out anywhere I wanted to go. They gave me a certificate that basically said I'm now a minister of the gospel. I can go and minister where I feel led. And for me, it was following my pastor who had planted a church about the same time I started that School of Ministry. He planted a church in a part of Maine that was sort of unreached in our mind as far as Bible churches, Bible teaching churches like Calvary Chapel. We're not saying there aren't great churches there, but that's where my pastor went. And I felt so compelled to go and help him. There's a character, Epaphroditus, in the New Testament, Philippians 2, and he brought Paul a letter, and it almost cost him his life. And I remember the Lord saying to me, that's who you need to be for this guy. You need to be there for him. You need to be to church before him if you can be. Leave after him. Set up, tear down, clean up, paint stuff. Do whatever you can do to help his role be easier. And so I saw that as a real challenge too. He had helped me so much. Now I wanted to turn around and help him the best I could with this church plant. And so for 2 years, just an amazing 2 years of learning how to plant a church and how to bring a new community of believers into an area was really interesting. And seeing that community embrace newcomers and then for that church to grow was truly awesome. And in my mind, I was at this point now developing this idea that I might be a church planter at some point. And I was thinking, like, here's my way, I'd be like, well, 10 years from now, after I've seen this church grow and understand it a little bit better, 10 years from now, I will maybe do my own thing and go plant the church myself. But I'm a long way from that in a lot of ways. I had only been a believer for a handful of years, a few years. And I'm 20 years old or so at this point. And the Lord clearly called me to move about 40 minutes away from where my pastor planted a church to start another church. It was in line with a vision that he had received from the Lord. Here's the second moment I wanted to share with you about my story. A week leading up to this prayer meeting that was going to conclude, it was a week of fasting and prayer. We spent the entire evening and night praying together and reading the scriptures and seeking the Lord. And leading up to that week, he had given us some things to pray about, and everything kind of started indicating to me that I didn't have a lot of ministry left to do. I had handed off all these ministries that I was doing, that I had started and been a part of. And I kept saying to myself, well, what's this next season going to look like? I'm sort of a blank slate here. This is kind of interesting. And I was getting this impression that I had to go and plant this church in Calais, Maine. And I thought, that can't be right. It just can't be right. There's no way. There's no way. Well, I had written something in my journal 7 months before when I visited that area. Very specific wording, very specific. And so we went to this prayer time. We're praying. The whole night, I just keep thinking, you're going to go to Calais. You're going to go to Calais. You're going to plant this church. And I'm like, no way, man. There's no way. I'm not, somebody else, I'll help somebody, but it's not me. The last few moments of the prayer meeting, my pastor said, all right, let's let the Lord speak to us. And so I really started to argue with God, like I did that night, about being a Christian. I started like, hey, Lord, it can't be me. I'm too young. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not qualified. I'm not sure I want to do this, all these kinds of things. And as I'm doing that classic argument, my pastor said, okay, well, we're going to finish our prayer time. And he said, but before we do, I think there's a man in this room that the Lord's calling to Calais, Maine. And I've never told my pastor I even went to that place. So I'm like, man, how does he know? I mean, how could that possibly be? And then the thing that he prayed was exactly what I had written in my journal 7 months before, word for word. So totally blown away, but I was also a little skeptical, like, does he know something? Does he talk to my wife? Like, what? That's weird. So I went up to him and I said, hey, you know that guy you're talking about? He's like, yeah. You mean? He said, I knew it was you. I just didn't have the guts to say it in front of everybody. And it blew me away. So I knew I'm supposed to go plant a church at 20 years old. And if you can go back just 3 years, I didn't even know how to get out of the gutter. I mean, literally and spiritually. I was in alleyways in Portland covered in my own vomit just 3 years before that. And now God's calling me to plant a church somewhere. It was a little overwhelming. And, the truth is, the people of Calais were so gracious, and they allowed such a young man to come into that community and get a church started. And my wife and I were there for 8 years, almost 8 years. And it was such an amazing time. We made so many great connections. We got that church planted and started. But just being so young and just working through all that was an amazing experience. In fact, I was considering and at the time excited about buying a burial plot. Like I was like, this is where I'm going to live the rest of my life, and I'm going to serve the rest of my days here. This church has accepted me. I'm going to be here and do this work. And well, somewhere in this process, a friend of mine had planted a church about the same time, and he really wanted me to consider taking it over in Belfast, Maine. And so much about that was challenging for me because I thought, well, that's not what we do. We go and plant churches and we live there for the rest of our lives. We don't go and hop around. We don't move to other places. But for a whole year, there was a lot of things that happened that kept drawing me back there. Even to the point where a few times I turned my friend down. I said, look, if you need an answer now, the answer is no. Let's just move on. Let's move on with our lives and find somebody else. But we both knew it was moving in that direction. And somehow the moment came at the perfect time when he sat down and laid things out to me and said, now is the time. And I remember we left that meeting and my wife was like, well, that's crazy, right? I mean, we're not going to go anywhere, right? And I was like, I think we are going to go. I think we're going to move to Belfast and take over that church right now. And it was a shock to her. It was a shock to me. It was a shock to everybody. But we knew that was the thing to do. So, again, just new believer, helping plant a church, going and planting a church, and now taking over a church. And so we have been here in the Belfast area for just over 6 years now. And it's been an amazing ride, just like everything else I've been a part of. But this church, so I came here just 2017, a few years before COVID hit. And the first thing my friend said to me, he said, look, this church needs a home. It needs a property of its own. It needs a building of its own. And that's your job. You're going to make that happen. I was like, all right, I see that as a challenge. We'll do this. Well, we were here for a couple years and then COVID hit. And during COVID, our church moved because we were renting from a college that shut down very quickly during COVID. We ended up moving to 7 locations in 5 different towns in this area. And all the while, making a change at a church is a big deal, but making changes like moving every other month, or in some cases we'd be in a location one day and we'd move the next Sunday. And the funny thing was, every time we moved, the church grew. People from those communities, sometimes we'd be in local papers because of controversy, because we were meeting outside and all sorts of different things. And it was a very interesting, challenging season. We had a tent one time by the water. We had got like a circus tent and we were doing services outside. And we knew the door was closing. We had a lot of problems with the town people and neighbors, and people were calling us super spreaders. And we didn't want that title. We wanted to be respectful, but we also wanted to push back where we thought it was appropriate with our legal rights as American citizens. Well, we were getting to the point we knew we should probably get out of here. And that tent, which had an amazing wind rating, just completely collapsed. And it was sort of like the Lord said, if you can't pack it up, I will. So he ended that. But in the process, we have moved all around. And even currently, we're renting from another church facility as I'm making this testimony here in 2023. One story I will share with you about our church family now, where we're at, is last year I came back from Africa. And I was very inspired and fired up. And I want to take to our leadership team and say, guys, I think it's time for us to build. We're going to build a church. I don't know how else to say it. This is what we're going to do. And the guy that picked me up from the airport on a Friday was really excited. He was like, that's awesome, but you're going to have to, dial it down. Again, the extreme personality, you're going to have to turn that down because it's a lot to take in. And so that's on a Friday. On Sunday, my first Sunday back at church in the pulpit, I had seen some friends I hadn't seen for over a year. And we're just connecting with them. And I felt led to tell them my vision. I just said, hey, it's so good to see you guys. Yeah, the Lord really spoke to me when I was in Africa. And we're going to start a building project. And you're like the first people to know about it. And they said, really? And they were very excited. I said, yeah. And they said, well, where is it? I said, well, if I had to pick a piece of land, it's like over here. And it's 20 acres. And they said, okay, well, how much is it? And I said, it's $95,000. They just both started crying. And they said 2 days ago, which would have been Friday, they said 2 days ago, the Lord told us to give the church $100,000 for a building project. And they had no idea. They had no idea what was going on, the things that God was working and doing. And so we saw that as a real obvious sign that the Lord is in this, And in all of these stories, it's really just supernaturally natural. It's nothing we did or conjured up. It's just trying to seek the Lord and what he wants to do. So currently, 2023, part of my testimony is as a pastor for the last 6 years of this church, just working through COVID, working through all the challenges. We're now moving into the phase of building. We're going to be building a big building, a school. We're starting a co-op in this fall. So we have big plans and visions for the future. But again, if you talk to me in this moment, it sort of makes sense now. But if you go back and tell the teenage Greg or the 20-year-old Greg, all this stuff that's going to go on, it's overwhelming. That's why I'm so thankful that the Lord leads us like a lamp unto our feet, a light unto our path. Just what's in front of us. He gives us that next mission, that next thing to focus on. And so that's sort of my testimony in a nutshell. Well, if I'm talking to an older generation or older person in ministry, don't be afraid to raise up young people. Like, work yourself out of a job. The saying that always stuck with me is, all success without succession is ultimately failure. So if you do all these great exploits for God, but you don't pass it along to somebody else, in a sense, you really failed. And it is a paradigm that we're seeing in the church today, where the older, wiser generation, there's a breakdown. And I think some of that's on the young generation, not willing to learn, not wanting to learn. But at the same token, part of my testimony is there's the willingness on the student, and then there's a willingness on the teacher to combine. I know that, as I talked about my pastor Aaron, the year after, when I was going to move out to his house, as the year ended, we met each other and we talked, and I thanked him so much for all that he had taught me. And he said, "Greg, you have taught me more than I've ever taught you." And that is a great picture of that older-younger relationship. So I think the challenge for an older generation investing in younger people is probably Revelation chapter 2, the Ephesian church. They were strong spiritually. They were strong in their doctrine. They fought off wolves. They're an amazing church with a lot of great pastors that had come through, but they had lost their first love. And that's easy to do, getting the formality, the faithfulness. And as we're locked into our Christian faithfulness, there's a world that's slipping away darker and darker. And I think it's going to be a real challenge for any Christian as they get older to maintain a soft heart, to care about the next generation and younger people, and to invest in them. To a younger generation, young guys coming up, I get to meet them and see them. And I'm not that old, but I've got enough years under my belt, 15 years of marriage and just almost as many years as a pastor. The first thing is 1 Timothy 3:1 says that if a man desires the office of a bishop, let's just say if a man desires leadership within the church, it says he desires a good work. And number one, it's work. Know what you're getting into. That if you want to serve the Lord, it's not an amusement park. It's fun. It has its moments, but it is work. It's very hard work. It's a lot of labor. So I would say know what you're getting into, but also know that it's a good thing. Don't doubt yourself and say, is it wrong for me to want this and desire this? No, I think it's a great thing that you would desire it. I mean, what's the alternative? Living life for yourself and doing whatever you want to do. So if you're desiring to serve the church, know what you're getting into, know it's a good desire, and also know that it is one of the most rewarding things you can do is serve the local church. I heard a pastor one time say, find a local church, pour yourself into it, and your life will never be the same. And anyone that does that, anyone that invests in the church, God's program, life for you and everyone you come in contact with is so worth it, and it's so rewarding. If you're in the Mid-Coast Maine area ever, whether you're vacationing or you live here, we would love to have you visit. Thanks for listening to my testimony, first of all. I don't know how long it ended up being, but if you hung with the whole thing, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time and listening. If you would like to visit our church, I could tell you a few things. We're not a typical, maybe what people have in their mind for church. And that's not to say that other churches are bad, but there are certain models of church that have been around for a long time. So when we talk about our church, it doesn't convey to people. They don't necessarily understand what we're doing. So I would say that if you're looking for a different kind of church experience, very much reverent, very much honoring to God, but maybe different than what you've experienced, and you want to give church a try again, I would love to have you visit us at Calvary Chapel, Belfast. We have a website. We are on all the social media platforms, and love to have you join us there. Another thing I would say too is this church, we are in a building project. I mean, there's a lot of funds to raise, and if that speaks to you at all, that's your kind of heart, is to give and see God's kingdom grow. I'd love to invite you to partner with us financially or prayerfully or even physically. Just come serve at our church. There's a lot of work to be done there. So again, thanks so much for listening, and please continue to pray for your brothers and sisters in Belfast, Maine, and the surrounding areas.